The year is 2011, Istanbul. Beneath the manicured gardens of the Topkapi Palace, where millions of tourists walk every year, the darkness has a weight that can almost be measured. It is a suffocating geological pressure, compounded by 5 centuries of silence. For the restoration team working in the lowest sub-basements of the Harem, the job was supposed to be routine, structural reinforcement of the foundations. But when a sledgehammer breached a section of masonry that wasn't on any blueprint, the air that hissed out didn't smell like damp earth. It smelled of beeswax, stale incense, and a terror so old it had turned to dust. The workers had broken into a blind room, a pocket of space sealed off from the world since the late 15th century. This was not a storeroom for grain or a vault for gold. It was a stone lung, a place designed for people who were meant to be inhaled by the empire and never exhaled again. Inside this stone capsule, the beam of a flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing walls that were not empty. They were scarred. The plaster was gouged with hundreds of desperate erratic markings, crude crosses carved not with iron tools, but with shards of pottery and, in some places, human fingernails. It was a chaotic tapestry of devotion scratched into the very bowels of the Islamic Caliphate. And there, near the floor, etched with a precision that defies the madness of the solitude, was a phrase in Latin that stopped the archaeologists cold. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. This wasn't just graffiti. It was a defiant scream from the grave, a message left by 18 women who were erased from every official ledger, but who refused to let their souls die in the dark. To understand why this message exists, we must leave the silence of the museum and return to the moment that silence began, to the roar of cannons in the mountains of Thessaly. The dawn over the Thessalian mountains did not break with the chirping of birds or the soft light of the sun, but with the shriek of cast iron tearing through the thinning mist. For 140 years, the bronze bell of St. Catherine's had dictated the rhythm of life in the valley, a liturgical heartbeat that marked the transition from matins to lauds. But at 6 a.m. mid-swing, that heartbeat was violently arrested. The Ottoman bombard, a massive siege cannon dragged by oxen from the foundries of Adrianople, delivered its payload with mathematical cruelty. The impact did not merely break the tower, it atomized the masonry. The bell, caught in its final oscillation, was obliterated, sending shards of consecrated bronze raining down like shrapnel into the herb gardens below. The sound was not a ring, but a metallic scream, a discordant, ear-splitting end to a century of prayer, instantly replaced by the suffocating, sulphurous silence of absolute conquest. When the dust of the bell tower finally settled, coating the terrified sisters in a layer of pulverized gray history, the silence that followed was heavier than the stone itself. The 23 women, kneeling in the debris of their sanctuary, expected the roar of bloodlust. They expected the azaps, the irregular Ottoman infantry known for their brutality, to swarm the breach with scimitars drawn, eager for the plunder that was their traditional payment. But the slaughter never came. Instead, the heavy oak doors of the convent were forced open with a methodical, terrifying slowness. Through the breach stepped not a horde of screaming berserkers, but a single figure, flanked by scribes. This was Hassan Pasha. He did not raise a sword. He raised a hand, and the wall of soldiers behind him froze. It was a display of discipline that was unnatural, almost inhuman, amidst the smoke of battle. Hassan Pasha walked through the courtyard with the casual indifference of a tax assessor inspecting a warehouse. He stepped over the rubble of the bell tower, ignoring the trembling Abbas Ilani, and signaled to his retinue. The men who followed him were not carrying torches to burn the convent. They were carrying leather-bound ledgers, inkpots, and quills. In the eyes of the Ottoman war machine, these women were not enemies to be slain, nor were they martyrs to be made. They were ganima, spoils of war. To kill them would be a waste of state property. With a bureaucratic coldness that was infinitely more chilling than rage, Hassan began the process of cataloguing the nuns, reducing human lives to entries in a column. He moved down the line of kneeling women, his gaze assessing their health, age, and potential utility in the imperial household, while the scribe behind him scratched the wet ink onto the parchment. Item 1. Female, unharmed, fit for transport. The bell was dead. The inventory had begun. The journey from the mountains of Thessaly ended not at the golden gates of a palace, but in the grime-choked shadow of the Galata Tower. This district, technically a Genoese colony until the conquest, remained the beating heart of the Mediterranean slave trade, a zone where the laws of God were suspended in favor of the laws of commerce. As the nuns stumbled off the galleys, their senses were assaulted by the cacophony of the erasure, the great slave market. It was a chaotic symphony of suffering, where Venetian merchants haggled with Ottoman dellals, auctioneers, over the price of human breath. The air here was thick, not just with the stench of unwashed bodies and salt water, but with the metallic tang of desperation. Here, dignity was stripped away quite literally. Captives were forced to stand naked on raised wooden platforms, while prospective buyers inspected their teeth, prodded their muscles, and examined their skin for defects, treating human beings with the same clinical detachment one would apply to livestock at a slaughterhouse. The brutality of the market was bureaucratic, codified by centuries of Roman and Islamic law that viewed the enslaved not as victims, but as liquid assets. Contemporary Venetian chroniclers, often writing with a mix of horror and pragmatic observation, described how young Albanian men were oiled to highlight their musculature, while women were grouped by utility, domestic drudges, wet nurses, or the more expensive carrier destined for the pleasure houses of the elite. This was the machine of flesh that fueled the empire's expansion. The nuns, chains rattling against the cobblestones, watched in terrified silence as families were dismantled within seconds. A mother sold to a weaver in Anatolia, her child sold to a tanner in Thrace, their screams drowned out by the auctioneer's hammer. It was a scene of industrial-scale dehumanization, justified by the conquerors as the natural order of the world. The weak serve the strong, and the defeated feed the victors. But then, the horror shifted. As the line of nuns approached the auction blocks, expecting to be stripped and sold to the highest bidder, Hassan Pasha did not stop. He did not signal the auctioneers. He marched them straight through the heart of the market, parting the crowd of hagglers and slaves like a dark prow cutting through water. They were not to be sold here. To the onlookers, seasoned flesh merchants who knew the codes of the capital, this was a chilling signal. These women were not common kapakulu, door slaves, to be traded for silver akçes. They were pençik, the Sultan's statutory 1/5 share of all war booty. They were reserved for the imperial household. As they left the noise of the market behind, walking toward the ferry that would take them across the Golden Horn to the Topkapi Palace, the nuns realized a terrifying truth. Being sold to a stranger might have been a mercy. To be kept by the Sultan was to vanish into a belly from which no one ever returned. They were being taken to a place where they would not belong to a master, but to the empire itself. The transition from the rocking motion of the galley to the static, suffocating stone of the Topkapi Palace was not marked by violence, but by a terrifying, ritualistic cleansing. Upon arrival at the lower gates, the nuns were not thrown into dungeons. They were marched directly into the hammam, the bathhouse reserved for the lower strata of the imperial staff. Here, the Ottoman machine began its work of metaphysical amputation. The rough black wool habits they had worn for decades, garments that were extensions of their very skin, symbolizing their marriage to Christ, were stripped away by silent, eunuch attendants. This was not merely hygiene, it was an act of erasure. The habits were not washed. They were piled in the courtyard and burned. As the smoke of their vows rose into the Istanbul sky, the women were scrubbed with coarse horsehair mitts and scented soaps, washing away the dust of Thessaly, the salt of the Aegean, and the captors hoped the scent of their former lives. It was a baptism of the profane, designed to wash away the Christian soul so that an Ottoman subject could be painted onto the blank canvas of the body. Once the physical traces of their order were scrubbed away, the psychological siege tightened with the introduction of the khiotan. The nuns were forced to don the attire of the seraglio, vibrant silk shalwar, trousers, embroidered yeleks, vests, and sheer veils that covered the hair but exposed the face. For a woman like Sister Eleni, who had not looked upon her own nakedness in 40 years, wearing the bright, soft silks of the harem was a torture far more acute than the lash. It was a cognitive dissonance weaponized by the state. The Ottomans understood what modern psychology would take centuries to codify. If you change the exterior shell, the interior identity begins to fracture. By forcing these ascetics to dress like concubines or court servants, the palace administration was planting a seed of madness. They became walking contradictions, their outer appearance screaming submission to the Sultan, while their inner minds desperately recited Latin prayers to ward off the demon in the mirror. The final stroke of this dehumanization was the theft of their names. In the imperial defter registry, there was no column for Sister Magdalena or Mother Superior. The Ottomans, heirs to the bureaucratic obsession of the Byzantines they conquered, reduced the women to integers. A scribe, dipping his quill into black ink, recorded them not as humans, but as assets of the Hazine-i private treasury. Sister Elani became Asset 44 Alpha. Sister Magdalena became Asset 44 Beta. This practice mirrored the cold logic of the Roman damnatio memoriae, but with a twist of Islamic fatalism. Your past did not exist because the Sultan had not decreed it. By refusing to speak their Christian names, the guards and overseers denied the women their connection to their own history. They were spoken to only in the imperative mood, commands, not conversations. This was the silence of the name, a technique designed to induce a state of social death long before the heart stopped beating, ensuring that when they prayed in the dark, they would eventually begin to question who exactly was praying. The silence that permeated the inner sanctums of the Topkapi Palace was not the peaceful quiet of a monastery. It was the heavy, predatory stillness of a hunter waiting in the brush. This unnatural atmosphere was enforced by a peculiar caste of servant known as the dilzis, the tongueless ones. These were men, often recruited from the ranks of the deaf and mute or surgically altered in childhood to ensure their absolute discretion. They were the perfect instruments of imperial will, living shadows who could not hear a conspiracy, speak a secret, or plead for mercy. They communicated with the Sultan using an intricate silent language of hand signals known as ixaret, a dark pantomime that governed the fate of the empire without a single word being spoken. To the Venetian ambassadors who visited the court, the sight of hundreds of servants moving in absolute silence was more terrifying than the roar of Janissary cannons. As one diplomat noted, with a shudder in his dispatches, "In the abode of the Turk, death makes no sound." For the nuns of St. Catherine, the presence of the Dilzes was a psychological horror that inverted their entire understanding of faith. They had spent their lives cultivating silence as a voluntary offering to God, a space where the soul could speak. But here, in the damp corridors beneath the Harem, silence was a cage. The Dilzes who guarded them and oversaw their labor were not just servants, they were also the Sultan's executioners, carrying the infamous silk bowstrings used to strangle condemned dignitaries without spilling royal blood. The nuns found themselves in a perverse reality where the only sound of freedom was the forbidden noise of their own whispers. To move one's lips in prayer was not merely a religious act, it was an act of high treason against the carefully curated silence of the palace. Every muttered Ave Maria was a sonic insurrection, a defiance of the mute guardians who watched them with dead, unblinking eyes, ready to snuff out their lives as quietly as one pinches a candle flame. In the anatomy of the Topkapi Palace, the room discovered by archaeologists was a tumor, a sealed cavity of damp masonry located beneath the scullery drains, where the condensation from the kitchens above dripped with the rhythm of a slow torture. Here, the concept of day and night ceased to hold meaning. The nuns existed in a state of ocular starvation, a permanent twilight that physiologically altered them. Over months of confinement, their pupils dilated to the very edges of their irises, desperate to catch photons that did not exist. This was not merely imprisonment, it was sensory erasure. In this black void, the mind begins to cannibalize itself, hallucinating shapes in the dark to compensate for the lack of visual input. To anchor themselves to reality, to prevent their consciousness from dissolving into the damp air, the women needed a focal point, a physical proof that they were still corporeal beings in a material world. They found it in the stone itself. The liturgy of the deep did not involve incense, chalices, or vestments. Its sacrament was friction. Sister Magdalena had managed to smuggle a shard of a broken Venetian looking-glass, a jagged triangle of silvered glass, likely discarded by a concubine in the upper harem, into the depths. This was their chisel. But a mirror is softer than stone. To carve a single line into the dense limestone of the foundation required thousands of repetitions, a grinding, scraping agony that took hours to make even a shallow groove. The click-hiss-click of the glass against the wall became their new heartbeat, replacing the bell of St. Catherine's. The process destroyed their hands. The sharp edges of the mirror sliced into their thumbs, mixing human blood with stone dust to create a dark, rust-colored mortar. When the archaeologists illuminated the walls centuries later, they found that the depth of the vertical beams of the crosses was often greater than the horizontal ones, evidence of the downward force of exhausted bleeding arms dragging the shard toward the earth, mimicking the gravity of the crucifixion. This compulsive carving was not simply an act of piety, it was a desperate psychological fortification against the void. Early Christian ascetics in the deserts of Egypt spoke of acedia, the noonday demon of listlessness and despair. In the bowels of the Ottoman capital, the nuns were fighting a war against total ego death. Every scratch on the wall was the assertion of "I am." It was a reclaiming of the physical space from the ownership of the Sultan. By scarring the Sultan's foundation, they were secretly rewriting the architecture of the palace, turning a profane dungeon into a consecrated catacomb. It mirrors the practices found in the darkest cells of the Roman Mamertine prison, where Peter and Paul were said to have scratched prayers into the rock. History shows us that when the human being is stripped of all agency, clothes, name, light, and time. The urge to leave a mark becomes the final, unconquerable instinct. The walls were not just an altar, they were a ledger of sanity kept by women who were slowly going blind. The end of the Sisters of St. Catherine did not come with a bang, but with a shift in the wind of imperial politics. On May 3rd, 1481, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror died in his camp at Maltepe, likely from a dose of opium meant to treat his gout, or, as Venetian spies whispered, poison administered by his own son. The death of a sultan is a tectonic event. The vacuum of power sucks the air out of the palace corridors. Istanbul descended into anarchy. The Janissaries, sensing weakness, rioted in the streets, parading the severed head of the Grand Vizier on a pike. In this interregnum of blood and fire, the new administration of Sultan Bayezid II sought to consolidate power by purging the excess of the previous reign. The sprawling, bloated household of the deceased conqueror was to be trimmed. Old concubines were retired to the old palace, useless servants were cast out, and the peculiar, silent captives in the sub-basement became a clerical error that needed correcting. The mechanism of their disappearance was captured in a fragmentary ledger from the Matbaa-Amir, imperial kitchens, dated to the early months of 1482. There is no mention of a trial, no record of execution, and certainly no Christian burial. There is simply a cessation of rations. A mid-level bureaucrat, likely overworked and indifferent to the human cost of his pen strokes, drew a single line through the entry for Group 44. Beside it, he wrote a single Ottoman term: Bertaraf, eliminated, disposed of, set aside. It is the language of inventory management, not homicide. Historians speculate that in the chaos of the transition, the blind room was simply walled up, or perhaps the women were taken to the Seraglio point at midnight, sewn into weighted sacks, and slipped into the Bosphorus, a traditional Ottoman method for silencing the harem's unwanted secrets. They did not die as martyrs. They were filed away as waste. But the bureaucracy failed in one crucial regard. It could not erase the stone. When the archaeologists broke the seal of the room 5 centuries later, they found the timeline of this tragedy etched into the wall. The carvings of the crosses, which had become deep and frantic in the final section, suddenly stop. There is no tapering off, no gradual fade, just an abrupt, jagged halt mid-stroke, capturing the exact moment the soldiers came for them. Yet below those unfinished lines, the Latin inscription remains, carved with a steady hand that suggests a terrifying peace of mind. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in darkness. In the end, the Ottoman Empire, which stretched from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Yemen, collapsed into dust and museums. Its ledgers are rotting in archives. Its sultans are bones in tombs. But the defiant scratch of a dying nun, hidden in the dark, outlived the machinery that tried to crush her. The darkness swallowed them, yes, but it did not overcome them. The sublime Ottoman state, which once dictated the fate of 3 continents, formally ceased to exist on November 1st, 1922. The dynasty that broke the walls of Constantinople and terrified the kings of Europe ended not in a glorious final charge, but with a signature on a piece of paper in a cold government office in Ankara. Today, the Topkapi Palace is no longer the abode of felicity. It is a sterile necropolis of tourism, managed by the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. The Harem, once the most forbidden and silent sector of the known world, is now trampled daily by thousands of sneakers. The air that once stagnated with the scent of rosewater and fear now smells of industrial disinfectant and camera batteries. In Thessaly, The convent of St. Catherine has effectively returned to the earth. The stone walls have been cannibalized by local farmers to build sheep pens, and the bell tower is nothing more than a grassy mound, indistinguishable from the hillside. The geographic and political realities that crushed Sister Elani and Sister Magdalena have been utterly dismantled by the slow, grinding indifference of time. Yet, inside the climate-controlled sarcophagus of the museum, beneath the feet of oblivious crowds, the scratches remain. They are the only anomaly in a perfect system of erasure. The silk kaftans of the sultans have faded in the light. The iron chains of the galleys have rusted into red dust. The ledgers that catalogued the women as disposable assets are crumbling in the state archives, eaten by worms and mold. But the carbon-based markings of human fingernails and the jagged gouges of a broken mirror, sealed in the airless dark of the blind room, have survived with the stubborn durability of a fossil. The empire spent 6 centuries building a fortress to protect its power, but in the end, it served only as a reliquary for the very people it tried to destroy. The irony is absolute. The stone meant to crush them became the amber that preserved them. The final verdict of history is not written in the gold leaf of the conqueror, but in the scar tissue of the survivor. Hassan Pasha is a footnote in a military logbook. Sultan Mehmed is a corpse in a tomb. The Ottoman Empire is a chapter in a textbook. But the 18 women of St. Catherine, stripped of their names, their habits, and their lives, achieved the one thing the empire could not purchase with all its plunder: permanence. They carved their existence into the foundation of their enemy's house, ensuring that as long as the palace stands, it stands upon their testament. They were meant to be ghosts, silent and forgotten. Instead, they became the structural integrity of the truth. The darkness did not consume the light. It merely provided the canvas.